The morning sun streamed through the towering glass windows of the company's grand lobby, painting the polished floors with golden streaks. Daniel adjusted the strap of his work bag on his shoulder and gave a glance at his son, Leo, who walked slightly behind him, his small sneakers squeaking faintly with each step. As the building's maintenance supervisor, Daniel had grown used to this environment, the marble counters, the sharp click of heels on the floor, the constant hum of voices that belonged to people with fancier titles and heavier paychecks than he would ever see. For Leo, though, this was a world of tall strangers and cold spaces, one he often observed with wide-eyed curiosity whenever he accompanied his father after school. Today, while Daniel headed toward the maintenance office, Leo slowed his steps. Across the room, on one of the sleek benches near the wall, sat a girl about his age, her school bag pulled tightly against her chest as though it was a shield. Her hair, neat but slightly frizzy at the edges, caught the sunlight, but her eyes remained lowered, darting nervously at the ground. She shifted her small fingers again and again around the bag's strap, fidgeting as though the silence pressing down on her was heavier than she could bear. Most adults walked by without noticing her, wrapped up in their phones, schedules, and urgent conversations. But Leo noticed. Something about the way she sat so stiffly, her knees pressed close together, her lips pressed into a thin line, stirred something inside him. Leo hesitated at first, glancing back to make sure his dad hadn't gone too far. Daniel was busy speaking to someone at the front desk, his deep voice blending with the sounds of the lobby. The boy took a step closer to the girl, his sneakers making a soft scuff on the floor. She lifted her eyes just enough to see him, then quickly lowered them again, as if the weight of even a glance was too much. He stopped a few feet away, unsure if she wanted company, but his natural curiosity pushed him forward. With a shy smile tugging at his lips, he said softly, "Hola." The single word felt strange in the middle of this sleek, English-speaking lobby, but it rolled off his tongue easily, something his grandmother had taught him at home. The girl's head snapped up, her eyes widening in surprise. For a second, it was as if she had been transported somewhere else, somewhere warmer, somewhere safer. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. Her lips trembled, and she blinked rapidly, but instead of looking away again, she whispered back, almost inaudibly, "Hola." Leo's smile grew. He took a seat on the bench beside her, careful to leave just enough space so she wouldn't feel crowded. He repeated another small phrase he remembered from afternoons spent with his grandmother, "Como estás?" His accent was clumsy, the words slightly broken, but the effort was sincere. This time, the girl's shoulders eased just a little, the tension loosening from her frame. She didn't answer right away, but her eyes softened, and for the first time that day, she wasn't hiding behind silence. To her, the boy's words weren't just sounds. They were echoes of a voice she once knew, the voice of her late mother, who used to sing her to sleep and whisper in the same language, a language that had vanished from her world when illness took her away. Leo didn't know her story. He only knew she looked like she needed a friend, and he had found a way to reach her. In that quiet corner of the bustling lobby, two children sat together, speaking in words too small to carry the weight of their lives, but strong enough to bridge a distance that adults had overlooked. For Amelia, the CEO's anxious daughter, those halting Spanish words unlocked something she hadn't felt in a long time, comfort, and the fragile beginning of belonging. Later that afternoon, the lobby had quieted down, the rush of executives and assistants thinning as the workday carried on. Daniel finally finished checking the inventory list for maintenance supplies and glanced toward the far side of the room, where he had left Leo. His heart gave a start when he noticed his son wasn't alone anymore. Sitting on the bench with him was Amelia, the CEO's daughter. Daniel had seen her around the building before, a fragile little girl with big eyes who often clung to her father's side, silent and withdrawn as though the world around her pressed in too tightly. Now she was leaning slightly toward Leo, her small hands resting more calmly on her lap, listening intently as his boy stumbled through words in Spanish. Daniel froze, a wrench still in his hand. He had only ever heard Leo speak bits of the language, phrases his grandmother patiently repeated to him on Sunday afternoons. He knew his son wasn't fluent, but Leo had always been eager to learn, delighted by the musical rhythm of the words. What struck Daniel wasn't the accuracy of his son's speech, it was the way Amelia responded. Her posture, usually so stiff, had softened. Her eyes, once darting nervously, now carried a faint glow of recognition and safety. She even let out a small laugh at something Leo said, a laugh so light and unguarded that it startled Daniel. It was as if someone had opened a window inside her, letting in air that had been missing for a long time. Daniel's chest tightened. He knew about Amelia's mother. Everyone in the building knew, whispered in hushed voices, how the CEO's wife had passed away after a long illness. People said Amelia had been close to her, that the loss had left her clinging to silence, like a bird afraid to sing again. And now here she was, laughing softly at his boy's clumsy attempts in her mother's language. Daniel lowered the wrench and leaned against the counter, not wanting to interrupt. He felt pride swelling quietly in him, pride not for anything he had done, but for the kindness in his son's heart. Leo had no idea about Amelia's grief, no understanding of her wealth or status, yet he had seen her sadness and chosen to sit beside her, offering the only gift he had, his effort, his attention, his words. The sound of footsteps pulled Daniel's attention to the doorway. His breath caught when he saw Mr. Grant, the CEO, stride into the lobby, briefcase in hand. His gaze quickly fell on Amelia and the janitor's boy sitting side by side. Daniel's stomach knotted. He knew how these things often looked, worlds colliding, the wealthy CEO's daughter mixing with the son of the maintenance man. Daniel braced himself, unsure if he should step forward, apologize, or pull his boy away before any misunderstanding flared. But before he could move, Mr. Grant stopped in his tracks. His eyes lingered on his daughter, on the soft curve of her smile, on the gentle Spanish words drifting between her and Leo. For a moment, Daniel couldn't read his expression. So he stayed still, silently watching, waiting to see whether the fragile connection his son had sparked would be welcomed, or broken. Mr. Grant stood frozen just inside the doorway, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the lobby. His hand tightened on the handle of his briefcase, but his eyes remained fixed on his daughter. For months, no, years, since his wife had passed, Amelia had carried a weight too heavy for a child. He had watched her shrink inward, speaking less, avoiding the gaze of others, clinging to him in silence as if words themselves were too dangerous. Countless tutors, therapists, and expensive specialists had tried to coax her voice back into the world, but nothing had worked. Yet here, in the simple company of a janitor's son, she was speaking. Not just speaking, smiling, laughing, and she was doing so in Spanish. The sound hit him like a jolt. It had been his wife's dream to raise Amelia bilingual, to fill her world with the warmth of the language she grew up in. She had sung lullabies in Spanish, told bedtime stories with tender accents, whispered soft, "Te quiero," before the light went out. But illness stole that dream, leaving unfinished sentences and unspoken lessons in its wake. Mr. Grant had buried those memories deep, too painful to revisit, and with them, Amelia had lost that part of her mother entirely. Or so he had thought, until now. His throat tightened as he listened to Leo's clumsy but earnest Spanish, each phrase rough around the edges but filled with intention. And Amelia responded, not perfectly, not even fully, but she responded. It was as if the boy had unlocked a door no one else could find, a door leading straight back to the comfort of her mother's voice. Mr. Grant blinked rapidly, his chest aching, torn between sorrow for what was gone and gratitude for what had just been returned. Beside the bench, Daniel finally noticed him. Their eyes met across the polished floor, two fathers from opposite worlds. Daniel's face held caution, even humility, as though preparing to defend what he already feared might be misunderstood. He cleared his throat quietly and said, almost apologetically, "He only knows a little, but sometimes a little is enough." The simplicity of the words struck Mr. Grant harder than he expected. He glanced back at his daughter, her small hands now relaxed at her sides, her shoulders eased in a way he hadn't seen since before the hospital stays and funeral black. The sight unraveled something inside him. His carefully maintained composure, the armor of a CEO who had built empires and commanded boardrooms, suddenly felt fragile in the face of a child's smile and the kindness of a stranger's son. Slowly, Mr. Grant nodded. His voice, when it came, was low and unsteady. "It's more than enough. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to breathe, not as an executive, not as a widower carrying endless burdens, but as a father who had just witnessed a tiny miracle. The week that followed unfolded like the gentle opening of a flower. Every afternoon, when school ended and Daniel stopped by the company lobby to check in with his staff, Leo and Amelia would find each other as though it had always been routine. At first, they sat quietly side by side, trading small phrases in Spanish, Leo repeating what his grandmother had taught him the night before, Amelia testing the words on her tongue like they were pieces of her mother's voice returned. Soon, the silence between them softened into laughter, into the kind of easy companionship that children create without effort or hesitation. Daniel often sat nearby, fixing a loose hinge, updating reports, or organizing his tools, but always with one eye on the pair. He marveled at how naturally his son leaned into kindness, how unafraid he was to reach into someone else's loneliness with nothing more than sincerity. It made him proud, and it also made him ache. He thought about his wife, Leo's mother, who had passed when Leo was still little. She would have been proud too. She would have smiled to see their son bridging gaps that adults often left untouched. Mr. Grant began to notice as well. At first, he lingered on the edges, watching from a distance, as though afraid that stepping too close would shatter the fragile bond his daughter had found. But gradually, he drew nearer. One evening, instead of hurrying past with his briefcase and a furrowed brow, he set it down and lowered himself to sit beside Amelia and Leo. He didn't speak much, he listened. He listened to Amelia's halting Spanish, to Leo's earnest encouragement, to the way his daughter's laughter carried notes of a melody he thought he'd lost forever. And though he was a man accustomed to control, power, and solutions, here he realized something simple. Healing sometimes came not from experts or expensive plans, but from small kindnesses offered freely. One afternoon, as the sun cast warm streaks across the lobby floor, Amelia turned to Leo after he proudly introduced a new phrase. Her voice was soft, but steady, gracias. Just one word, but the weight of it was immense. It carried memory, love, and a piece of her mother's unfinished dream. Daniel, who was polishing a set of tools nearby, paused mid-motion. Mr. Grant, sitting close with his hand resting gently on his daughter's shoulder, felt tears sting his eyes. He hadn't heard her speak that word since his wife had whispered it during her final days. He looked at Daniel then, and for the first time, it wasn't as CEO to maintenance supervisor, or rich man to working-class father. It was simply one parent to another, bound by the fierce and fragile love they carried for their children. No words were needed, gratitude lived in the quiet nod they exchanged. And as Leo grinned at Amelia, ready to share the next phrase he had practiced, Daniel understood something deeper. Sometimes fate doesn't finish the stories we start. Sometimes, it waits for unexpected hearts to carry them forward, in the voices of children, in the echo of languages left behind, in the kindness of strangers who choose to listen.